For 20 years, no one spoke my name. Not in holiday toasts, not in hospital waiting rooms, not even in the footnotes of family stories retold to sound kinder than they truly were. I became a ghost who still paid property taxes, still mailed birthday cards that were never acknowledged, still existed just enough to be inconvenient. And then, one quiet Tuesday morning, the phone rang, and a stranger said my name perfectly, as if it had never been forgotten at all. There are moments in life that feel staged, as though the universe itself has been holding its breath. That call was one of them. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, trained to deliver information without emotion. He identified himself as an executor. He referenced an archive. He mentioned a clause. And then he said a number that did not belong to my life, at least not the life I had been living. $510,000, preserved in silence, attached to my name like a signature written decades ago and never erased. I remember standing in my kitchen, the kettle screaming on the stove because I had forgotten it entirely. The light through the window caught the dust in the air, turning it into something almost holy. I pressed my hand against the counter to steady myself, because my body understood before my mind did. This was not about money. This was about recognition. About a truth that had waited patiently while I learned how to survive without it. For years, I had told myself that being forgotten was a kind of freedom. No expectations meant no disappointments. No invitations meant no refusals. I built a quiet life on that belief, reinforced it with routine and humility, convinced myself that absence was a choice I had made rather than one imposed on me. But that phone call peeled back the lie with surgical precision. You cannot be written into an archive unless someone intended for you to be found. The executor explained just enough to ignite old memories. A clause embedded deep in legal language. Conditions unmet until now. A delay that was deliberate, not accidental. My name resurfacing not out of nostalgia, but necessity. Someone had planned this with care, knowing time would do what confrontation could not. Knowing silence would mature into clarity. I did not cry. That surprised me. Instead, I felt something colder and steadier settle into my chest, like a long overdue alignment. Faces I had trained myself not to picture came rushing back anyway. A dining table where my chair was slowly edged out. A will reading I was not invited to attend. Phone numbers that stopped working only for me. 20 years is a long time to pretend those things didn't happen. It is also long enough to forget how sharp they were. The executor asked if I remembered signing anything, decades ago, anything at all that involved preservation or contingency. I said no, because that was easier than admitting I remembered everything. I remembered being asked to safeguard documents no one else wanted to deal with. I remembered being reliable when it earned no applause. I remembered being dismissed right after my usefulness had been extracted. When the call ended, the kitchen was silent again, except for my own breathing. I turned off the stove, poured the water down the sink, and sat at the table alone. For the first time in 20 years, I said my own name out loud, just to hear it exist in the room. It sounded unfamiliar. It sounded powerful. And it sounded like it was about to change everything. Because whatever was waiting in that archive had survived the same erasure I had. And if it had finally been summoned into the light, then so had I. My name is Margaret Hale, and I am 63 years old. I have learned that names age differently than people do. Mine spent 2 decades unused by the mouths that once shaped it, while I continued forward, quietly, carrying it like a pressed flower between the pages of a life no one else bothered to read. I was not dramatic in my disappearance. I did not storm out or issue ultimatums. I simply stopped being included, and eventually, I stopped trying to be. I live alone now, in a narrow house with creaking stairs and windows that catch the afternoon light just right. I work part-time cataloging municipal records, a job that suits someone who understands the value of things others overlook. I drink my coffee black, wake before dawn, and keep my expectations modest. People mistake that for contentment. It is not. It is adaptation. There is a difference, and I learned it the hard way. 20 years ago, I was the dependable one. The organizer. The keeper of dates and documents. If something needed to be remembered, I remembered it. If something needed to be preserved, I preserved it. I believed that consistency earned permanence. What no one tells you is that reliability often makes you invisible. You become infrastructure. Useful, silent, replaceable. Until one day, you are removed and only noticed when something collapses. When I think back to the moment I realized I had been erased, it was not loud. It was a birthday card returned unopened, marked address unknown, even though I hadn't moved. It was hearing about a family wedding through a neighbor's congratulatory smile. It was the realization that my absence had become convenient. I did not confront anyone. I absorbed it. I told myself it was temporary. Then I told myself it was deserved. Then, finally, I told myself it was over. Time changes a person in ways that mirrors never show. I became careful with my trust, deliberate with my kindness. I stopped volunteering information about myself. I learned how to exist without witnesses. And in doing so, I became someone my former family would not recognize even if they tried. Perhaps that is why they never did. The executor's call did not just retrieve my name from a legal file. It retrieved a version of me I had buried to survive. A woman who once believed that truth mattered, that documentation was a form of love, that doing the right thing would eventually be seen. I had told myself that woman was naive. I told myself I was wiser now. But wisdom, I was beginning to understand, is not the same as surrender. As I sat at my kitchen table after the call, I opened the old drawer where I keep things I cannot bring myself to throw away. Receipts. Letters. Carbon copies of forms signed by hands long gone. I did not know what I was looking for, only that my body remembered before my mind did. There was a pattern here, one that stretched back decades, and I had been part of it whether I liked it or not. The executor had said the clause activated only when certain conditions were met. Time-based conditions. Silence-based conditions. Conditions that suggested someone had anticipated exactly how this family would behave once I was no longer useful. That thought settled heavily in my chest. Because it meant someone had seen what I refused to name back then. And they had trusted me enough to leave something unfinished in my care. I looked around my small kitchen, at the life I had built from fragments, and felt something unfamiliar rise within me. Not anger. Not greed. Recognition. The quiet certainty that the story I had been telling myself for 20 years was incomplete. That I had not been forgotten because I was insignificant. I had been forgotten because remembering me would have been inconvenient. And somewhere, sealed in an archive, was proof that my absence had always been part of the plan. Families rarely fracture all at once. They erode. Slowly, politely, with smiles that linger a second too long and questions that stop being asked. Ours was no different. From the outside, we looked intact for years after I began to disappear. Holiday photos were still taken. Group emails still went out. My name remained on contact lists long after anyone intended to use it. That is how exclusion works when people want to believe they are still kind. I was the eldest of 3 siblings, the only daughter, and for most of my life, the one expected to smooth things over. My brothers were louder, more confident, better suited to occupying space without apology. I learned early that my role was to support, to manage, to absorb. When our parents aged, that dynamic intensified. I handled paperwork. I tracked medical appointments. I kept copies of everything, because no one else thought it mattered until it did. There was a family archive long before there was a legal one. A filing cabinet in my father's study, filled with deeds, letters, insurance policies, and handwritten notes he never trusted anyone else to organize. I was the one he called when he couldn't remember where something was. I was the one who understood his shorthand, who knew which documents were outdated and which ones carried weight. My brothers joked about my hoarding. They never asked what I was preserving. When my mother died, the tone shifted. Grief rearranges priorities, and not always in honorable ways. Decisions were made quickly, often without me. Conversations happened after the fact. I was informed, not consulted. I told myself it was temporary, that emotions were high. But patterns reveal themselves to those who are paying attention. And I had always paid attention. The first major exclusion came disguised as efficiency. A meeting with an attorney scheduled while I was at work. A will revision summarized for me over the phone, stripped of nuance. I was assured everything was fair, a word that rarely survives contact with money. I asked questions anyway. That was when the resistance began. Subtle at first, then sharper. I was told I was overthinking, that I was being difficult, that my insistence on documentation was unnecessary. It is astonishing how quickly a family can recast you when you stop being convenient. I went from reliable to suspicious, from helpful to obstructive. The same habits that once made me indispensable became reasons to sideline me. I was no longer invited to discussions where decisions were finalized. I received summaries instead. Then updates. Then nothing at all. By the time my father passed, the exclusion was complete. I learned of his death from a distant cousin. The funeral had already happened. I was stunned less by the omission than by the precision of it. Every step had been calculated to avoid confrontation. Silence is easier than accountability. Distance is easier than honesty. In the years that followed, I told myself I had been erased by grief, by chaos, by misunderstandings. But deep down, I knew better. This was not accidental. It was structural. An architecture of exclusion built piece by piece, with plausible deniability at every stage. And I had been too tired, too hurt, too conditioned to keep the peace to dismantle it. What unsettled me now, in the wake of the executor's call, was the realization that someone had seen this structure forming long before it was complete. Someone had anticipated that I would be pushed out, that my access would be restricted, that my name would be inconvenient to mention. And they had done something about it quietly, without telling me, trusting that time would reveal what words could not. As I sat with that thought, the family I remembered and the one that existed now began to separate in my mind. One was built on obligation and performance. The other on avoidance and erasure. And somewhere between them was an archive that had survived both. An archive that held not just documents, but intent. Whatever waited there had been protected from the very people who believed they controlled the narrative. And for the first time, I understood that my exclusion had not been the end of my role in this family story. It had been the condition that made the next chapter possible. Betrayal is rarely a single act. It is a consensus. A quiet agreement reached without your presence, reinforced by repetition, and justified by the belief that you will not fight back. In my case, it unfolded with the kind of civility that allows everyone involved to sleep at night. No raised voices. No dramatic ultimatums. Just decisions made in rooms I was no longer invited into, followed by the expectation that I would accept the outcome with grace. The clearest betrayal did not come when I was excluded from the will reading, or when my father's funeral passed without my knowledge. Those were symptoms. The true betrayal came later, when I realized that the family archive I had helped maintain had been quietly relocated. Files removed. Originals replaced with copies. Entire folders gone. The cabinet in my father's study stood half empty, its drawers lighter, its purpose altered. When I asked where everything had gone, I was told it was being handled. That phrase followed me for years. It was always being handled. By someone else. Somewhere else. I was assured that my involvement was no longer necessary. That everything important had been digitized. That my habit of keeping physical records was outdated. I was thanked for my past help and dismissed from the present. It was a professional severance delivered in familiar language, designed to sound reasonable. What I did not know then was how deliberate that removal had been. The archive was not just a collection of papers. It was leverage. Proof. A record of intentions that did not align with the story my brothers were beginning to tell themselves and others. My attention to detail had made me dangerous, not because I sought conflict, but because I preserved facts. Facts do not bend easily to convenience. In the months following my father's death, I noticed financial decisions being made that contradicted his stated wishes. Property sold too quickly. Accounts consolidated without transparency. A trust dissolved under the guise of simplification. Each time I raised a question, I was met with reassurance and subtle irritation. I was told I was dwelling, that I needed to move on, that grief was making me suspicious. Eventually, the calls stopped. Emails went unanswered. Invitations ceased entirely. My absence became normalized. The family adjusted. New routines formed without me. And in that silence, something else happened. My brothers grew comfortable, confident. They began to believe that whatever had been done would remain unchallenged simply because no one was left to challenge it. What they did not know was that not everything had been removed. Not everything had been consolidated or destroyed. Years earlier, my father had asked me to separate certain documents, just in case. He never explained further. He did not need to. He trusted my instincts because they mirrored his own. I had followed his instructions quietly, without fanfare, storing what he asked me to store where only I would remember. At the time, I thought it was unnecessary caution. Now, I understood it as foresight. The betrayal, then, was not just theirs. It was also mine, in a way. I had betrayed myself by believing that my role ended when I was pushed out. That my responsibility dissolved with my access. That peace required my disappearance. I had underestimated the power of what I had preserved, and the patience of the man who had asked me to preserve it. When the executor mentioned a clause embedded deep in the archive, my mind returned to those sealed folders, to the documents I had not seen in decades but could still picture clearly. I began to understand why the clause had remained dormant for so long. Why it required silence. Why it activated only after certain actions had been taken without my consent. The betrayal had triggered it. As that realization settled in, I felt something shift. Not rage, but clarity. The kind that arrives when you finally see the shape of what was taken from you and what was left behind. My family believed they had written me out of the story. In truth, they had unknowingly written themselves into a contingency they could no longer control. And the archive was about to speak. The executor did not push for details, and I was grateful for that. He spoke in measured tones, careful not to reveal more than protocol allowed, but he gave me enough to know that what had been triggered was not accidental. Clauses do not awaken on their own. They respond to conditions, to sequences of behavior anticipated long before anyone believes they are being watched. When we ended the call, I understood that before anything else could happen, I needed to understand precisely what had been preserved, and why. I began where I always had, with records. My municipal job had taught me that every system leaves a trace, even when it believes it has cleaned up after itself. Transfers create timestamps. Consolidations leave trails. Silence, especially prolonged silence, is rarely as empty as it appears. I requested copies of filings I had once helped prepare, this time as an outside party. The irony was not lost on me. I was now a stranger asking permission to see pieces of my own past. What arrived in the mail over the following weeks confirmed my suspicions. There were discrepancies. Dates that did not align. Signatures that appeared where consent had never been given. Assets that had been reclassified just enough to avoid scrutiny. None of it was overtly illegal. That was the most unsettling part. It was careful, thoughtful, designed to pass unnoticed by anyone not intimately familiar with the original structure. I compared these documents to my memory, and then to what I still had. The folders my father had asked me to store separately were exactly where I had left them, tucked behind old tax records in a box labeled too generically to invite curiosity. When I opened them, I felt the weight of time press down on me. The paper had yellowed. The ink had softened. But the intent was unmistakable. There were notes in my father's handwriting outlining conditions he feared might arise. Scenarios he could not prevent directly, but could respond to indirectly. He had anticipated consolidation, reallocation, even exclusion. And in response, he had created a safeguard that relied on patience rather than force. A clause that required absence. That required my removal from the process in order to validate its necessity. I understood then why I had never been told. If I had known, I might have resisted more openly. I might have confronted my brothers, disrupted the pattern too early. The clause depended on them believing they had succeeded. It depended on their confidence, their certainty that I was no longer a factor. The more I read, the clearer it became. The archive referenced by the Executor was not just a storage facility. It was a legal repository created specifically to hold contingent documents, accessible only when predefined criteria were met. My name appeared not as a beneficiary in the traditional sense, but as a condition, as a constant, as proof that the clause had been activated not by my action, but by theirs. I spent nights at my kitchen table, cross-referencing, annotating, reconstructing a timeline no one else thought mattered anymore. I did not feel vengeful. I felt focused. This was not about punishment. It was about restoration. About ensuring that what had been quietly altered would be quietly corrected, with the same restraint that had once erased me. The final piece fell into place when I noticed a date buried in the Executor's paperwork. A review trigger scheduled to occur exactly 6 months after the clause's activation. Enough time for notice to be served. Enough time for responses to be prepared. Enough time for those who believed the matter settled to grow complacent again. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes, letting the truth settle. This was not a sudden opportunity. It was a long game reaching its conclusion. And I had been part of it from the beginning, whether I realized it or not. The investigation was over. What remained was the decision of how, and when, to let the truth surface. There is a moment in every long silence when you realize it has done all the work it can. Mine came not with anger, but with resolve. I had spent weeks gathering, reading, confirming. I had traced every thread back to its origin and forward to its consequence. Nothing about what I now understood was accidental. And nothing required my voice to be loud in order to be heard. The Executor contacted me again in early spring. This time, his tone had shifted. He was no longer informing me. He was coordinating. The clause had moved from dormant to active, and that meant procedures, notices, and disclosures. He explained that formal communication would be sent to all relevant parties. My brothers would be notified that a contingent review had been triggered, and that assets previously considered settled were now subject to reassessment. I listened without interruption, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I imagined the moment the letters would arrive. The confusion. The immediate assumption that this was a mistake. The quiet panic that would follow when they realized it was not. I did not take pleasure in that image. I took comfort in its inevitability. The Executor asked if I wished to be present for the initial conference. I declined. That surprised him. It surprised me too, until I understood why the answer felt right. My presence would shift the focus. It would invite defensiveness, turn the process into something personal. The strength of this clause was that it did not require my confrontation. It required only my confirmation. Instead, I chose preparation. I organized my records, not to accuse, but to contextualize. I wrote timelines that showed intent without commentary. I labeled documents clearly, cross-referenced sources, and prepared summaries that spoke for themselves. This was not an ambush. It was an unveiling. In doing so, I felt a release I had not expected. For years, I had carried the weight of being misunderstood, misrepresented, and erased. Now, the truth existed independently of my explanation. It did not need my defense. It simply needed to be seen. I thought often of my father during this time. Of the quiet way he had anticipated all of this. He had known his sons. He had known their strengths and their blind spots. And he had known me. He had trusted that I would not rush, that I would not retaliate emotionally, that I would let the system he designed do its work. The turning point, I realized, was not when the clause activated. It was when I chose not to intervene prematurely. When I allowed the process to unfold as intended, even though part of me wanted to speak, to explain, to be acknowledged at last. Restraint, in this context, was not submission. It was alignment. Weeks passed. Notices were delivered. Requests for documentation were made. I received forwarded correspondence from the Executor, carefully curated, factual, devoid of speculation. My brothers were cooperating, outwardly at least. They had no reason not to. They still believed this was procedural, something that could be resolved with the right explanations. What they did not yet understand was that the explanations had already been written, years ago, in my father's hand, stored in an archive designed to outlast denial. As the date of the formal review approached, the Executor asked one final question: whether I was prepared for the outcome to be public within the family. Whether I understood that this would alter relationships permanently. I told him I understood. What I did not say was that those relationships had already been altered. Permanently. This process would not break anything that had not already been hollowed out by silence. The truth was coming. Calmly. Methodically. And for the first time in 20 years, I did not feel the need to brace myself for its impact. Consequences rarely arrive with drama when they are long overdue. They arrive with paperwork, with measured language, with phrases like, upon review, and, in light of newly activated provisions. That was how it began. The formal assessment did not accuse. It recalibrated. It acknowledged prior actions without condemning them, then demonstrated, methodically, how those actions had fulfilled the exact conditions my father had anticipated. The Executor shared the outcome with me first, as required. Assets previously consolidated under my brother's control were reclassified. Funds earmarked for discretionary management were frozen pending redistribution. And the clause, the one that had waited in silence for 2 decades, executed precisely as written. $510,000, preserved and adjusted for time, was released to me, not as a gift, but as a correction. The language mattered. This was not compensation. It was restoration. The funds represented what had been protected, not what had been taken. That distinction stripped the situation of emotional argument. It left no room for grievance, only for acknowledgement. My brothers were informed shortly after. I was not present, but I did not need to be. Their reactions filtered back to me through neutral channels. Confusion first. Then disbelief. Then the slow realization that this outcome had not been triggered by my complaint, but by their own decisions. They had acted in ways that activated safeguards they had never known existed. What unsettled them most, I suspect, was not the money. It was the narrative. For years, they had framed my absence as disengagement, as indifference. Now, the record told a different story. It showed that my removal had been anticipated, that it had been accounted for, that it had consequences beyond social discomfort. It revealed that someone had trusted me enough to design a system that would speak on my behalf when I could not. There were attempts at contact. Carefully worded messages. Invitations to talk things through. I declined them all. Not out of spite but out of clarity. There was nothing left to explain. The archive had done that work more precisely than I ever could. The Executor asked if I wished to make a statement. I did not. Silence had served me well. It would continue to do so. My absence from the conversation forced everyone else to confront the documents without distraction. It prevented the outcome from being reframed as a personal dispute. This was not about hurt feelings. It was about fidelity to intent. The funds were transferred within days. I watched the numbers appear on my screen with a calm I had not expected. They did not feel like a windfall. They felt like something returning home after a long detour. I paid debts I had carried quietly. I set aside what I did not need. I made no announcements. What mattered more than the money was what shifted inside me. The weight I had been carrying, of doubt, of self-questioning, of internalized blame, lifted. The record had corrected itself. Not loudly, not cruelly, but conclusively. I heard later that the family dynamic changed. That conversations became strained. That trust, once assumed, was now questioned. I did not take satisfaction in that. Structures built on omission do not survive exposure. That is not punishment. It is consequence. For 20 years, they had forgotten my name. Now, they could not say it without remembering why it mattered. And that, more than any sum of money, was the justice my father had designed. The story, however, was not over. Consequences ripple outward. And the final impact was still to come. When the noise settles, what remains is not triumph but space. That was the first thing I noticed in the weeks after everything concluded. My days felt wider, less crowded by the constant low-grade vigilance I had lived with for years. I was no longer waiting for another omission, another quiet slight, another reminder that I did not belong where I once had. The record had been set straight, and with that came an unexpected stillness. I did not move houses or change my routines. I continued my work cataloging records, though my relationship to them shifted. I saw them now not just as remnants of the past, but as witnesses. Proof that truth endures when people do not. That realization softened something in me. I had spent so long believing that survival required disappearance. Now I understood that preservation could be an act of self-respect. My brothers did not reach out again. The silence returned, but it felt different this time. It was no longer imposed. It was mutual. They had their version of the story, fractured and incomplete. I had mine, documented and closed. We existed in parallel, connected by blood but separated by choice. I did not grieve that distance the way I once might have. Grief requires longing. What I felt was release. I thought often of my father during this period, of the quiet way he had planned for a future he would not see. I understood now that his final gift to me was not the money. It was the validation. The assurance that my instincts had been right all along. That my carefulness, my insistence on documentation, my refusal to rush decisions, these were not flaws. They were strengths he recognized and trusted. With the funds, I did something modest but meaningful. I endowed a small local archival project, ensuring that community records, marriage licenses, property deeds, handwritten minutes from forgotten committees, would be preserved rather than discarded. It felt right. A continuation of the work I had always done quietly, now made visible without fanfare. I also allowed myself a few luxuries I had denied myself for years. Time off without guilt. A new chair that supported my back properly. Fresh paint on the walls, chosen not for resale value but for comfort. These were not indulgences. They were acknowledgements. Signals to myself that my comfort mattered. There were moments when old anger resurfaced, usually uninvited, usually late at night. I let it pass. Anger, I had learned, is often grief wearing armor. I had already done my grieving. What remained was understanding. And understanding does not demand retaliation. The executor sent a final note, closing the file. He thanked me for my cooperation and remarked, carefully, on the elegance of the clause. I smiled at that word. Elegant. It was. Not because it punished, but because it waited. Because it trusted time to reveal what confrontation might have obscured. In setting things right, nothing was restored to what it had been. That was never the goal. What was restored was accuracy. Alignment. The quiet satisfaction of knowing that my life was no longer shaped by a lie I had been forced to carry. As I looked forward, I felt no urge to reclaim a place in the family that had excluded me. I had built something steadier on my own. Something honest. And for the first time in decades, I felt ready to name it. There was only one thing left to do. To reflect on what this story truly meant. There is a lie we are taught early, especially those of us who learn to be useful before we learn to be valued. We are told that if we endure quietly, if we keep the peace, if we make ourselves smaller for the sake of harmony, we will eventually be rewarded with belonging. That patience will soften others. That loyalty will be remembered. That time will correct what courage does not challenge. Time does correct things. But not in the way we are promised. What I learned, standing on the far side of 20 years of erasure, is that silence is not weakness. It is a test. And not everyone passes it. Some people reveal their true nature only when they believe no one is watching, when they think the record has ended and the witnesses have left. That is when intent becomes visible. My family believed my absence meant consent. They mistook my restraint for indifference, my quiet for surrender. They filled the space I left with their own justifications and grew comfortable there. What they did not understand was that silence, when paired with truth, accumulates weight. It waits. It documents. And eventually, it speaks with an authority no argument can undo. The money was never the point. It could not restore years of exclusion, nor was it meant to. Its purpose was symbolic, corrective. A line drawn through a false narrative. A confirmation that what I had sensed all along was real. That I had not imagined the shift. That I had not exaggerated the omission. That my experience mattered, even when no one acknowledged it. Ethical justice does not humiliate. It does not seek applause. It restores balance and then steps back. That is what my father understood. He did not try to control his sons. He did not confront what he knew would be denied. Instead, he trusted structure, patience, and truth. He trusted me, not to fight, but to endure long enough for the truth to stand on its own. If there is a lesson here, it is not about revenge. It is about record. About the quiet power of preserving what others dismiss. About knowing when to speak and when to let systems reveal what people try to hide. About understanding that being written out of a story does not mean you are gone. Sometimes it means you are being repositioned. I live simply now, but not invisibly. I say my name without hesitation. I take up space where it is earned, not begged for. I no longer confuse peace with absence or love with tolerance of harm. I have learned that walking away can be an act of integrity, and that waiting does not mean forgetting. For 20 years, they forgot my name. What they never realized was that forgetting me activated the very thing that would ensure I was remembered correctly. And that is the quiet power of truth. It does not chase those who run from it. It waits until they build their lives on the assumption that it never existed. There is a myth we are taught early, especially those of us who learn to be dependable before we learn to be protected. We are told that endurance is noble, that patience is proof of character, that if we absorb enough discomfort without complaint, fairness will eventually notice us. It is a comforting lie. It keeps families intact on the surface while teaching the most reliable among us to disappear politely. For a long time, I believed that lie. I believed that staying quiet was a form of maturity. That not making waves meant I was stronger than those who did. When my name stopped being spoken, I told myself it was temporary. When decisions were made without me, I told myself it was simpler that way. When years passed and nothing changed, I told myself this was just how life worked for people like me. What I learned, standing on the far side of 20 years of erasure, is that silence is not passive. It is revealing. When you step back far enough and long enough, people show you exactly who they are when they believe there will be no consequences. They tell the truth with their behavior, with their shortcuts, with what they justify to themselves once they think no one is watching. My family mistook my absence for consent. They believed my quiet meant agreement, that my lack of resistance erased my relevance. They filled the space I left with their own explanations and grew comfortable there. What they never considered was that silence, when paired with truth, accumulates weight. It documents. It waits. And eventually, it speaks with an authority no argument can dismantle. The money that surfaced after all those years was never the point. It could not restore birthdays missed or funerals unattended. It could not rewrite the emotional cost of being written out of your own history. Its purpose was simpler and more profound. It corrected the record. It confirmed that what I had experienced was real. That my instincts had been sound. That my erasure had been anticipated, not imagined. Ethical justice does not shout. It does not humiliate. It restores balance quietly and leaves no room for retaliation because it does not need it. The clause my father created was not an act of punishment. It was an act of trust. Trust in time. Trust in structure. Trust in me to endure long enough for the truth to emerge without being forced. I understand now that walking away is not always surrender. Sometimes it is strategy. Sometimes it is self-preservation. And sometimes it is the only way to allow a larger truth to unfold without interference. I did not disappear because I was weak. I disappeared because staying would have required me to become someone I was not. I live differently now. Not louder, but clearer. I say my name without apology. I take up space where it is earned, not negotiated. I no longer confuse peace with absence or love with tolerance of harm. I have learned that being forgotten by people who benefit from your silence is not a failure. It is information. For 20 years, they forgot my name. What they never realized was that forgetting me activated the very thing that ensured I would be remembered correctly. And that is the final truth I carry with me. Silence is not empty. It is observant. And when paired with truth, it never forgets.